do some narrative writing, but I don't know where to start. I have ideas, but... Oh, you write stories, right? Do you have some pointers?
Yes. But, you see, I'm rushing this chapter for publication, so I'm sorry. If I wasn't, I'd personally get out of the job and help you with that.
What should I have expected from you?
Nothing but a new chapter this week, haha. Anyway, since this is my situation, I'll just send you a video. Hang on. Let me search for it. It's on YouTube. It's from Kurang Vlogger ng Kuwait, so I'm sure they know what they're talking about, since it's filled with educational content, a lot of which have something to do with writing. You can check out the other vids if you're interested. Hang on, let me send you the link.
You must be here because there's a story that you want to tell.
If so, you've come to the right place.
Here to learn about narrative writing, didn't you?
Narration, storytelling, narrative writing, they're the same thing. Before we start our session, let's get some definitions straight. We don't want you getting confused with terms, alright? Story is a sequence of events in chronological order, while plot is the element of a story. It covers the sequencing and relation between these events, and breaks the story down into parts from the exposition to the ending. A narrative, lastly, is how the events are structured and told.
Think of it this way. A story is like a long piece of string. It's straight and is entangled. Plot is the string jumbled, but you get to know which part gets wrapped around which and are trying to untangle it, while narrative is the string used for string art. It's messy and organized and not at the same time, but you could make sense out of it and it's nice to present. Anyways, you want to get started with narrative writing, yeah? Well, that's why you came here in the first place. So, do you have your manuscript? Oh, okay, thank you. I'll just take a look. What's this? This reminds me, honestly speaking, of those horribly written books in Wattpad that are all tell, and tell. They're a pain to read, you know? It doesn't properly immerse readers into the story, so it doesn't even achieve any one of two aims. One of being taking the reader to another world, or two, making people want to forget everything they've read and reread it, because it's a horrible experience. I'm sorry, but I have to be honest with you. It's horrible. And even just looking at this start, you've already done a full-on info dump, and it's information worth a gazillion Wikipedia pages. So listen, okay? You don't spill everything. That just ruins the plot and doesn't make readers curious or interested about what's going to happen. Remember this, readers are like characters. Characters in a story should have a motivation that's strong enough to make them go want to explore the world, fight monsters, all to achieve their goal. So if you want your readers to pick this thing off of the shelf and put it into their library, don't just spoon feed the information or just do a full-on info dump on them, especially in the first few pages, because that just turns them off. You have to make them curious enough to keep them motivated to turn the pages, because that's why cliffhangers exist. Like, especially in the series, writers put cliffhangers so that you get more inclined to read the next book. So don't spill too much info, that's a big no-no, and don't withhold too much either, unless that's what you're aiming for in your narrative. So to make your narration effective, there are 3 things you gotta keep in mind. Number 1, vivid description of details. Number 2, consistent point of view and consistent verb tense. And number 3, a well-defined point or significance. So let's start with point number 1. Since you're on your writing journey, I think you might be familiar with the phrase, show, don't tell. Bruh, you're not? How? What sort of rock have you been living under all this time? Oh wait, maybe that's too much? Maybe you just didn't Google up writing tips because you're clearly a beginner. So anyways, that's like one of the basic pieces of writing advices. Actually, wait, no. Most common pieces of writing advices that you'd hear from pretty much every writer out there. It's one of the basics. So, show, not tell. Telling is storytelling in this very bored, bland way that doesn't appeal to the senses. It's like plain food without condiments or rice without ulam. Like, yeah, you can just say, Bea walked to school, but that's... You know what I mean? By appealing to the senses, I mean describe what the characters see, hear, smell, feel, taste. Immerse the reader into the experience of the character. And I don't just mean that you were going to outright tell them, Betty feels cold, or contrary to what's written on the label, it doesn't taste like strawberry, or Mike's mad. You have to show. Showing is describing the situation the characters are in, describing what the characters see, hear, smell, feel, taste, describing what they're doing, how they're responding to something, how they feel emotionally, or their mental state. For example, instead of Betty feels cold, try describing her actions. Like, what would you do when you feel cold? Do your teeth chatter like... Do you shove your hands into your pockets, or do you wrap your coat tight around yourself? Let's think of what Betty would do. Okay, and then let's try applying that. So, how about this? Betty shivered as she rubbed her hands together, occasionally blowing some air into them in an attempt to keep them warm. Better, right? Of course, different characters would respond differently in accordance to the situation, but this is a good start, I'll say. How about the second example? It doesn't taste like strawberry. Let's dive deeper in describing the taste. Like, what if it tasted bitter instead? Let's draw a mind map around that. Bitter. So, what tastes bitter? How would we describe bitter? So, let's try comparing it to something that tastes bitter. Unlike the labeling on the product, the thick red liquid tasted like molten metal, like a smoothie made from nothing but bitter gourd. Oh my gosh, I could already taste it in my mouth. But that means that way of narrating it is effective. Do you get it? You get it! That's great. I'll leave it at that. However, if you want more examples of that, go grab a book and then look for those paragraphs where the writer is describing something. Although the amount of details they put would differ in accordance to the scene. Okay, so on to the next thing to keep in mind. consistent point of view, and verb tense. So the first half, point of view, otherwise known as POV, or perspective. So through whose eyes are we watching the story unfold? Is it a character in the story? Or is it someone observing the characters? We can figure this out through the pronouns used in the story. So, if it uses first-person pronouns like I, we, or us, it means that the writer is using first-person perspective or first-person POV. When you use this, you put the reader in the same position as the character in the story. You have them see things the way that character sees things and have them experience the same thing the narrator, your character, does. On the other hand, if the narrator uses third-person pronouns, it's a third-person POV. This has two types. The first one being the regular third-person POV, where the narrator talks about almost everything except for what goes on in the character's heads. For readers to have access to that sort of info, the POV has to be an omniscient third-person POV. Omniscient meaning all-knowing. And the other thing is that if it's in third-person POV, it means that the narrator is dispassionate and objective. Okay? So yeah, you can't just shove your opinions through the third-person POV. Just so you know. And first-person POV, third-person POV, and omniscient third-person POV are the most commonly used POVs. But if you're still feeling a bit freaky, like you did earlier, you can of course use second-person POV and keep using used throughout the story. I'm not saying that you can't do it. I'm not gonna stop you if that's what you want to do. And if that's what you want, good luck with that. But one thing to keep in mind, if you want to use first-person POV and switch up the character narrating every now and then, set limits. I don't remember where I read it, but it's pretty much advisable to have a limited number of perspectives you show the story in. Like, less than 6 people. And don't switch it up too much. Give the readers a good heads up when you do. And if you want to keep switching and not confuse readers with who's saying, thinking, or doing what, just use omniscient third-person POV. That way you can focus from one character to another, and it will save you from creating misunderstandings. Or maybe you can try making it the POV of a character who can read everyone's minds. Oh wait, no, that doesn't work. As for verb tense, this is also important. You can't change it as you please. It's annoying and confusing. Keep it consistent so that you don't take the readers on multiple trips to the past, present, future, past, further back past. Stop isekaiing them. You have a setting, right? Do you want your character to narrate things as they happen or after they happen? Pick one and be consistent with it. For example, in Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, we have the main character, Percy Jackson, telling the story after the events were over. Thus, he used a consistent past tense throughout the whole thing. With the exception of the introduction though. He, the protagonist himself, was warning readers to turn away if they were, by any chance, a demigod. During that part, he was using more or less present tense, if I remember correctly. For the third characteristic of an effective narrative, we have significance. It's the wait, actually I forgot the term. What was it called? It's the element to the story that sort of like... Oh, yeah, I get it. Theme. There should be a message that you want to convey through the story. This message should be weaved into your narrative. To find this out, try asking yourself, how do you want the story to be remembered? Or what is it about human nature and human experience that your narrative wishes to convey to your readers? Wow, that's deep. The answer to that, dear, is your well-defined point. It's sort of the unifying idea born out of all the elements in the story. A universal human truth unraveled as one reads further. We've gained yet another enlightenment. Okay, so for example, we have Egnoid. It's not a written narrative, yeah, it's a webcomic by Archie the Red Cat. But the central message or idea behind it is love. Love of all sorts. The ones between lovers, friends, family members, you know, agape, philia, eros. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing these correctly, but you get what I mean.
So now you know the characteristics, but what about things you could use to add some, I don't know, spices to narrative? You're curious, aren't you? Okay, so let's talk about narrative devices. Writers like you use these to help you pace the story by focusing, skipping, shortening, or lengthening a certain event. First up is anecdote. It's a brief narrative written from the writer's experience. You could use it as an introduction, an example, a closing statement, or a memento to your reader. And by brief, I mean it's 10 minutes shorter than a short story. The next is flashback. Pretty sure you're familiar with this. It's when you quickly look back an event that happened in the past. It's the scene where the character reminisces a memory that happened long ago, or when the narrator just shoves you into the past for a while since that part is relevant to the situation the character are facing. Writers make use of it to introduce a character's backstory or simply introduce a person the character meets in the past. I'll give you two examples of this. The prologue of The Land of Story, The Wishing Spell by Chris Colfer. You introduce to two characters, both of those identifies aren't relevant until you're close to the end of the story. Flash forward, as you can tell in the opposite, it's sort of like giving the reader a quick review of what's to come before dragging them to the past or to the present. An example of this is the prologue of The Beginning After the End. Earlier by Turtle Me, where a child named Arthur flips through an encyclopedia containing information about the world he lives in, which is something that happened after the event of chapter 1, where the protagonist, a dying king, opens his eyes to discover that he was a newborn baby. And yes, he's the same boy who appeared in the prologue. Fourth is time summary. This is when the writer does a time skip. An example of this is Sola Cola's Royal Secret, I Am a Princess. The reader is given a quick rundown of event that happened in the protagonist Neuma's first two lives before taking them to the present, where she is living 3 years old child living her third life. Another way of doing a time summary is by doing a time skip. This is relevant through phases like weeks passed, that afternoon, 2 days later, and time passed quickly soon. Next is time stretch. So you know the scene in dramas where the male lead and female lead meets eyes and keeps staring at each other while everything around happens in slow motion. That's time stretch, making it as if time stood. Okay, so back to we were discussing. This is essentially making it feel like every single second is longer than a second. One way to do this is by describing things, and yes, using show, the first tip given to you earlier. This is because when you describe things in depth, paragraphs tend to get longer, so you end up immersing the reader in a certain moment. This can be used for scenes like when the character is staring at their love interest's eyes, or when the character is quietly standing up on the stage feeling anxious. If you didn't figure it out, time summary and time stretch both help with controlling the pacing of story or use them well. As for the last one, we've got dialogue. This is basically your character conversation with other character in the story. And no narrators. Don't tell everything based on what they observe. Dialogue is a way to show what is happening in narrative. I mean, why don't we also learn things about through the way they talk? We have the ability to identify a Karen when we hear one. Dialogue is an effective way of showing your character is and what they're like. For example, in your character a rude guy, you can show that through their language they could ignore another character when they're supposed to say thank you, or simply not use homophones when they're supposed to. Are they the opposite? Well, your character could probably be more inclined to use please, thank you, whatever possible. And it looks like we are done. So remember, to make a good narrative, you should show, not tell, use a constant verb and verb tense, and have well-defined points. Remember that you can also use narrative devices like anecdotes, flashback, flash forward, time stretch, time summary, and dialogue to add some spice to this boring and horrible written manuscript. So take this and apply what you just learned. Have fun! That was very helpful information, Dam.
See? And I didn't even have to go in depth myself.
Yep, thanks. I'm leaving a like, and these people have earned a new subscriber. This channel doesn't get enough of them.
True. Anyways, good luck on that. I'm almost done with writing this chapter.